Welcome to Midnight and Murder, a true crime series for sleeping, where true crime meets calm and mystery meets the mind at rest. This series contains some of the most famous American serial killers, but also some lesser known. Let's go. Story 1, The Darkness Within, Carl Panzram's Reign of Terror. In the annals of American criminal history, few names evoke the same chilling combination of brutality and philosophical darkness as Carl Panzram. While serial killers like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer captured headlines decades later, Panzram's story remains one of the most disturbing chapters in the early 20th century's catalog of human evil. His tale is not just one of murder and mayhem, but of a man who declared war on the entire human race. Born Charles Carl Panzram on June 28, 1891, in rural Minnesota, his childhood was marked by poverty, abuse, and an early introduction to violence that would shape the monster he would become. The sixth of 7 children born to Prussian immigrants, Panzram's formative years were spent on a failing farm where his father's alcoholism and his mother's harsh discipline created an atmosphere of constant tension and fear. The first signs of Panzram's antisocial behavior emerged when he was just 8 years old. After being caught stealing apples from a neighbor's orchard, he was severely beaten by his parents and sent to bed without supper. That night, young Carl crept out of the house and burned down the neighbor's barn in an act of revenge that foreshadowed the calculated brutality that would define his adult life. When questioned about the fire, he showed no remorse, only satisfaction at having gotten even. By age 11, Panzram had become incorrigible. His petty thefts escalated, and his violent outbursts became more frequent. His mother, overwhelmed and desperate, made a decision that would prove catastrophic. She sent him to the Minnesota State Training School, a reform institution that promised to straighten out wayward boys, but instead became a breeding ground for future criminals. The training school was a house of horrors masquerading as rehabilitation. Guards routinely beat inmates, older boys preyed upon younger ones, and the entire system operated on a philosophy of breaking down the human spirit through cruelty and degradation. For young Panzram, who had already experienced significant trauma, this environment completed his transformation from troubled child to sociopathic predator. It was at the training school that Panzram first encountered systematic sexual abuse. Older inmates and even some staff members subjected him to repeated assaults, experiences that would later manifest in his own violent sexual crimes. The institution's motto, "Fear God and honor the King," became a source of bitter irony for Panzram, who emerged from the experience with a hatred for God, authority, and humanity itself. Upon his release at age 14, Panzram had been fundamentally changed. The scared little boy who had stolen apples was gone, replaced by a calculating young man who viewed the world as his enemy. He immediately returned to crime, but now with a sophistication and coldness that belied his youth. His first major offense as a teenager was breaking into a store and stealing a gun, which he would later use in his first murder. The early 1900s provided the perfect backdrop for a predator like Panzram to operate. America was experiencing rapid industrialization and urbanization, creating transient populations of workers who moved from city to city seeking employment. Law enforcement was poorly coordinated between jurisdictions, and forensic science was in its infancy. For a man willing to kill without hesitation or remorse, it was an ideal hunting ground. Panzram's criminal career truly began when he enlisted in the Army under a false name in 1907. Even military discipline couldn't contain his antisocial tendencies. He was court-martialed multiple times for theft, assault, and insubordination. His service record reads like a catalog of violent incidents, including an attempt to burn down a military prison where he was being held. When he was finally discharged dishonorably, he had learned valuable skills in weapons, tactics, and survival that would serve him well in his future crimes. Following his military discharge, Panzram embarked on what he would later describe as his career of crime and destruction. Unlike many serial killers who develop specific patterns or rituals, Panzram was an equal opportunity predator. He robbed, raped, and murdered with seeming randomness, striking wherever opportunity presented itself. His victims included men, women, and children of all ages and backgrounds. One of Panzram's most notorious early crimes occurred in 1908 when he broke into the home of former President William Howard Taft in New Haven, Connecticut. Taft was not yet president at the time, serving as a Yale professor. But the symbolic nature of the crime was not lost on Panzram. He stole jewelry, money, and a pistol, later claiming that he used Taft's own gun to commit several murders. Whether this was true or merely another of Panzram's boasts designed to shock, it demonstrated his contempt for authority and social order. The pistol theft marked the beginning of Panzram's most prolific period of killing. Between 1910 and 1928, he claimed responsibility for 22 murders, though the true number may have been higher. His victims were found across the country, from the lumber camps of the Pacific Northwest to the ports of the eastern seaboard. Each crime scene told the same story: a predator who killed without mercy or hesitation. Panzram's methodology was as varied as it was brutal. Sometimes he would befriend lonely travelers, offering them work or companionship before robbing and killing them. Other times he would break into homes in the dead of night, terrorizing families before taking their lives and valuables. He showed particular cruelty toward children, claiming that he enjoyed snuffing out their young lives because it caused the most pain to their parents. One of his most horrific sprees occurred during a trip to Africa in 1920. Working as a merchant seaman, Panzram jumped ship in Angola and disappeared into the interior. When he emerged weeks later, he boasted of having killed 6 native guides and raped dozens of women and children. He claimed to have contracted a venereal disease during this rampage, which he then intentionally spread to other victims upon his return to America. The psychological profile that emerges from Panzram's own writings and the accounts of those who knew him reveals a man who had completely rejected human society and morality. Unlike many serial killers who maintain facades of normalcy, Panzram made no attempt to hide his nature. He was openly contemptuous of law, religion, and social conventions. In his letters and autobiography, he expressed a philosophy of pure nihilism, viewing existence as nothing more than an opportunity to inflict suffering. What set Panzram apart from other criminals of his era was his intelligence and self-awareness. He understood exactly what he was and felt no shame about it. In his correspondence with criminologist Henry Lesser, Panzram wrote extensively about his motivations and methods, providing unprecedented insight into the mind of a serial killer. His letters reveal a man of considerable intelligence who had chosen evil as a conscious philosophical stance. Panzram's relationship with Lesser began during one of his many incarcerations. Lesser, who worked as a guard at the District of Columbia Jail, recognized something unusual about this particular prisoner. Despite warnings from other staff about Panzram's violent nature, Lesser began engaging him in conversation and eventually convinced him to write his autobiography. The resulting manuscript, over 40,000 words long, stands as one of the most chilling documents in criminal history. In his writings, Panzram showed no remorse for his crimes. Instead, he expressed regret only that he hadn't killed more people. He described his victims with cold detachment, reducing human beings to mere objects for his amusement. His account of murdering 3 young boys in Connecticut is particularly disturbing, as he describes their terror in pleading with obvious satisfaction. The autobiography also reveals the calculated nature of Panzram's crimes. Far from being the random acts of a madman, his murders were carefully planned operations designed to minimize his chances of capture while maximizing the suffering of his victims. He studied police procedures, learned to forge documents, and developed networks of criminal associates who could help him disappear when needed. Panzram's criminal career came to an end in 1928 when he was arrested for burglary in Washington, D.C. By this time, he was tired of running and seemed almost relieved to be caught. During his interrogation, he confessed not only to the burglary, but to numerous murders spanning 2 decades. Detectives initially dismissed his claims as the ravings of a madman seeking attention, but as they investigated his stories, they found evidence supporting many of his confessions. The trial of Carl Panzram became a sensation in the national press. Here was a man who openly admitted to being a serial killer decades before the term was coined. He showed no remorse, no desire for mercy, and no interest in mounting a defense. When asked how he pleaded to the charges against him, he reportedly replied, "Guilty, and I'm proud of it." Perhaps most disturbing was Panzram's attitude toward his inevitable execution. Rather than fighting the death penalty, he actively advocated for it. He expressed frustration with legal delays and appeals, stating that he wanted to die as soon as possible so he could get to hell and start terrorizing the devil. He famously told the judge, "I wish the whole human race had one neck and I had my hands around it." While awaiting execution, Panzram continued his correspondence with Henry Lesser, producing some of the most chilling insights into criminal psychology ever recorded. He expressed no fear of death, only anger that he would no longer be able to kill. His letters reveal a man who had become so consumed by hatred that he viewed his own execution as just another opportunity to cause pain to those who cared about him. The end came on September 5, 1930, when Carl Panzram was executed by hanging at the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. Even in his final moments, he remained defiant. When the executioner asked if he had any last words, Panzram reportedly snarled, "Yes, hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill a dozen men while you're screwing around." The legacy of Carl Panzram extends far beyond his crimes. His autobiography and letters provided criminologists and psychologists with unprecedented insight into the mind of a serial killer. His case helped establish many of the diagnostic criteria still used today to identify and understand antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy. Modern criminal profilers study Panzram's methods and motivations to better understand how serial killers operate. His ability to move freely across state and national boundaries while avoiding capture for decades highlighted the need for better coordination between law enforcement agencies. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit still references his case when developing profiles of similar offenders. Perhaps most importantly, Panzram's story serves as a cautionary tale about the long-term effects of childhood abuse and institutional neglect. While nothing can excuse his horrific crimes, his early experiences at the Minnesota State Training School demonstrate how a system designed to rehabilitate troubled youth can instead create monsters. His case contributed to reforms in juvenile justice and the recognition that harsh punishment alone cannot correct antisocial behavior. The psychiatric community has long debated whether Panzram was born evil or made that way by his experiences. His own writings suggest he believed both nature and nurture played roles in his development. He claimed to have been born with violent tendencies that were then nurtured and amplified by the abuse he suffered. Modern neuroscience suggests he may have been right, as research has shown that childhood trauma can literally rewire the developing brain in ways that promote violent behavior. Carl Panzram died as he lived, without remorse or redemption. His story reminds us that evil is not always the result of mental illness or temporary insanity. Sometimes it is the conscious choice of an intelligent individual who has decided that causing suffering is the only thing that gives life meaning. In a world that prefers to believe that all people are fundamentally good, Panzram stands as a disturbing reminder that some individuals are simply beyond salvation. His case continues to fascinate criminologists, psychologists, and true crime enthusiasts nearly a century after his death. Books, documentaries, and academic papers continue to examine his life and crimes, searching for clues that might help prevent future Carl Panzrams from emerging. Yet perhaps the most chilling aspect of his legacy is the knowledge that somewhere out there, another troubled child might be taking the first steps down the same dark path that led Panzram to become one of America's most notorious serial killers. The story of Carl Panzram is not just about one man's descent into evil. It is a mirror held up to society, reflecting our failures to protect the vulnerable and our inability to recognize and address the warning signs of developing psychopathy. As we sleep safely in our beds, secure in the belief that such monsters belong to the past, we would do well to remember that the capacity for such evil still exists, waiting for the right combination of circumstance and opportunity to emerge from the shadows once again. Story 2, The Gray Man, the horrifying true story of Albert Fish. In the annals of American criminal history, few names evoke the same level of revulsion and fascination as Albert Fish. Known by many monikers, the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Brooklyn Vampire, Fish remains one of the most disturbing serial killers ever to walk American soil. His story is not merely one of murder, but of a descent into madness so complete and grotesque that it challenged the very understanding of human psychology in the early 20th century. Albert Hamilton Fish was born on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C., into a family already touched by madness and misfortune. His father, Randall Fish, was 75 years old when Albert was born, while his mother, Ellen, was just 32. The significant age gap between his parents was merely the first of many unusual circumstances that would shape Albert's twisted psyche. The Fish family tree was gnarled with mental illness. Albert's uncle suffered from religious mania, often claiming to have direct conversations with God. His brother Walter was confined to a state mental institution after a complete psychological breakdown. Another brother died in the same institution years later. Even Albert's mother showed signs of severe depression and what would now be recognized as bipolar disorder, experiencing dramatic mood swings that terrified her young children. When Albert was just 5 years old, his elderly father died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving the family in dire financial straits. Unable to care for her children, Ellen Fish made the fateful decision to place Albert in St. John's Orphanage in Washington, D.C. This institution, which was supposed to provide care and protection for vulnerable children, instead became the forge in which Albert's disturbed mind was shaped and hardened. The orphanage was a place of systematic cruelty and abuse. The children were subjected to regular beatings, often for minor infractions or sometimes for no reason at all. Albert would later claim that he was beaten so frequently and severely that he began to associate pain with pleasure, a psychological condition that would manifest in increasingly disturbing ways throughout his life. At St. John's, Albert was introduced to practices that would become lifelong obsessions. He witnessed and participated in acts of self-mutilation among the older boys, who would insert needles into their skin for the perverse pleasure it brought them. Albert began to experiment with these practices himself, finding that the pain brought him a strange sense of satisfaction and sexual arousal. The young boy also developed what he called his love for the regular beatings administered by the orphanage staff. While other children cowered in fear when called for punishment, Albert began to look forward to these sessions with an anticipation that disturbed even the hardened staff members. He would later describe these beatings as his first sexual experiences, though he was far too young to understand the implications of what was happening to him. When Albert was 9 years old, his mother's financial situation improved enough for her to reclaim him from the orphanage. However, the damage had already been done. The boy who returned home was no longer the innocent child who had been placed in care 4 years earlier. He had been transformed into something darker, carrying within him the seeds of the monster he would eventually become. Back in his mother's care, Albert's behavior became increasingly erratic and disturbing. He would disappear for hours at a time, returning home with unexplained injuries and a strange, distant look in his eyes. His mother noticed that he had developed unusual eating habits, often refusing normal food in favor of raw meat or fish. She also discovered that he had been stealing needles from her sewing kit, though she never learned what he was doing with them. As Albert entered adolescence, his sexual deviance began to manifest more clearly. He developed an obsession with pain, both inflicting it and receiving it. He would spend hours inserting needles into his skin, particularly around his genitals, claiming that the pain brought him indescribable pleasure. Medical examinations conducted decades later would reveal that Albert had dozens of needles embedded in his body, some so deeply that they had become infected and caused permanent damage. Albert's first known sexual encounter occurred when he was 12 years old, with a boy from his neighborhood who was similarly disturbed. This relationship introduced Albert to practices that would become central to his later crimes: bondage, torture, and the consumption of human waste. The relationship also marked the beginning of Albert's lifelong preference for children as sexual partners, a preference that would drive him to commit increasingly heinous acts. In his late teens, Albert Fish began a period of wandering that would last for several years. He traveled throughout the United States, working odd jobs and supporting himself through petty theft and prostitution. During this time, he claimed to have had sexual encounters with men in at least 23 states, often involving violence and torture. Albert's travels brought him into contact with a wide variety of people, many of whom were as disturbed as he was. He learned new techniques for inflicting pain and discovered increasingly perverse sexual practices. He also began to develop his skills as a predator, learning how to identify vulnerable victims and how to gain their trust before revealing his true intentions. During his wandering years, Albert also began to experiment with murder. He would later claim to have killed his first victim during this period, though the details of this crime were never verified. What is certain is that Albert's time on the road allowed him to refine his methods and develop the techniques he would later use to terrorize families across the country. It was also during this period that Albert began to develop his distinctive appearance and mannerisms that would earn him the nickname the Gray Man. He cultivated a non-threatening persona, dressing in simple gray clothing and adopting the demeanor of a gentle, grandfatherly figure. This carefully constructed facade would prove to be one of his most effective tools, allowing him to gain access to children and families who would never have suspected his true nature. In 1898, at the age of 28, Albert Fish married Anna Mary Hoffman, a woman 9 years his junior. To outside observers, the marriage appeared normal, even happy. Albert had settled down, found steady work as a house painter, and seemed to be living the life of a respectable working-class man. The couple would eventually have 6 children together, and Albert appeared to be a devoted father and husband. However, the reality of Albert's domestic life was far different from its outward appearance. Anna would later describe her husband as a man of strange and disturbing habits. He would disappear for days at a time without explanation, returning home with unexplained injuries and a wild look in his eyes. She noticed that he had developed an obsession with religious texts, particularly those dealing with sacrifice and punishment. Anna also discovered Albert's collection of newspaper clippings, which detailed crimes of violence and sexual assault. He seemed particularly fascinated by cases involving children and would study these articles with an intensity that frightened his wife. When she confronted him about his collection, Albert would claim that he was simply interested in the moral lessons these stories provided, but Anna suspected there was something darker behind his fascination. The marriage began to deteriorate as Albert's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would subject his children to bizarre religious rituals, claiming that he was teaching them about sin and redemption. These lessons often involved mild forms of torture and humiliation, which Albert justified as necessary for their moral development. Anna also began to suspect that her husband was having affairs, though she never discovered the true nature of his extramarital activities. In reality, Albert was using his time away from home to pursue his growing obsession with children. He would lurk around schools and playgrounds, watching potential victims and planning future crimes. Albert Fish's first confirmed murder occurred in 1910, though he would later claim to have killed several people before this date. The victim was Thomas Grimes, a young boy from New York City who had been reported missing by his family. Albert lured the boy away from his home with promises of candy and toys, then took him to an abandoned building where he tortured and killed him. The murder of Thomas Grimes marked a turning point in Albert's criminal career. The act of killing had provided him with a level of sexual satisfaction that his previous crimes had never achieved. The combination of power, control, and violence created an intoxicating experience that Albert became desperate to repeat. Over the next several years, Albert would claim to have murdered dozens of children, though investigators were only able to confirm a fraction of these killings. His methods became increasingly sophisticated and brutal. He would carefully select his victims, often targeting children from poor families who might not be immediately missed. He developed techniques for disposing of bodies that made it difficult for investigators to link the crimes to him. Albert's murders were not simply acts of violence, but elaborate rituals that satisfied his complex psychological needs. He would torture his victims for hours or even days before killing them, drawing out their suffering to maximize his own pleasure. He also began to engage in cannibalism, claiming that the consumption of human flesh provided him with spiritual power and sexual gratification. The crime that would ultimately lead to Albert Fish's capture began on May 25, 1928, when he arrived at the Budd family home in Manhattan. The Fish family had placed a classified advertisement in the newspaper, seeking work for their teenage son, Edward. Albert, calling himself Frank Howard, responded to the advertisement, claiming to be a wealthy farmer from Long Island who needed help with his farm. Albert's appearance at the Budd home was carefully calculated. He arrived dressed in his typical gray suit, carrying himself with the dignity of a respectable businessman. He spoke politely to Edward's parents, Albert and Delia Budd, and impressed them with his apparent wealth and respectability. He even left a small amount of money as an advance on Edward's wages, promising to return the following week to take the boy to his farm. When Albert returned to the Budd home on June 3rd, 1928, he brought with him a gift for the family, a package of strawberries. He explained that his plans had changed slightly and that he would prefer to take Edward to a birthday party for his niece before beginning work on the farm. The Buds were charmed by their visitor's thoughtfulness and readily agreed to the change in plans. However, Albert's attention had shifted from Edward to his 10-year-old sister Grace. The little girl was beautiful and innocent, exactly the type of victim that Albert preferred. He began to focus his conversation on Grace, asking her about her interests and complimenting her appearance. When he suggested that Grace might enjoy attending the birthday party as well, the family readily agreed. Albert left the Bud home that day with Grace, promising to return her by evening. The family waited anxiously through the night for their daughter's return, but she never came home. When they attempted to contact the address Albert had provided, they discovered that it was false. Frank Howard, the wealthy farmer from Long Island, did not exist. Their daughter had vanished without a trace. The disappearance of Grace Budd launched one of the most intensive missing person investigations in New York City history. Detective William King of the Missing Persons Bureau took personal charge of the case, interviewing hundreds of witnesses and following up on thousands of leads. The investigation consumed his life for the next 6 years as he pursued every possible clue in his desperate search for the missing girl. The investigation was complicated by Albert Fish's careful planning and execution of the crime. He had used a false name and address, paid for everything in cash, and left no physical evidence at the scene. The only descriptions the police had to work with were the memories of the Budd family, who remembered a kindly, grandfatherly man in a gray suit. Detective King's investigation revealed that similar crimes had been committed throughout the region, all involving a man matching Albert's description. Children had disappeared from their homes or while playing outside, always after being approached by a friendly older man who offered them treats or promised to take them somewhere special. The pattern was consistent, but the perpetrator remained elusive. The investigation took on a personal dimension for Detective King, who had children of his own. He could see the devastating effect that Grace's disappearance had on the Budd family, and he became determined to bring their daughter's killer to justice. He worked tirelessly on the case, often at the expense of his own health and family relationships. As the years passed without progress, the Grace Budd case began to fade from public attention. Other crimes demanded the police department's resources, and there were those who suggested that the investigation should be scaled back. However, Detective King refused to give up, continuing to pursue leads and interview witnesses long after others had lost hope. On November 11, 1934, more than 6 years after Grace Budd's disappearance, the family received a letter that would change everything. The letter, written in crude handwriting on cheap paper, was addressed to Mrs. Budd and contained details about Grace's fate that only her killer could have known. The letter was a horrifying confession, describing in explicit detail what Albert Fish had done to Grace Budd. He wrote about taking her to an abandoned house in Westchester County, where he had stripped her naked and strangled her with his bare hands. He described how he had dismembered her body and consumed her flesh over a period of 9 days, claiming that she had been delicious. The letter was signed a religious fanatic, but it contained enough specific details to convince investigators that it was genuine. The author described Grace's clothing, the conversation he had had with the Budd family, and details about the abandoned house where the crime had taken place. Most importantly, the letter contained information that had never been released to the public, proving that it had been written by Grace's killer. Detective King immediately began analyzing the letter for clues. The handwriting was distinctive, and the paper bore a watermark that could potentially be traced. More importantly, the envelope contained a return address, though it was partially obscured by a stain. Using chemical analysis and careful examination under magnification, investigators were able to determine that the letter had been mailed from a rooming house in Manhattan. The return address on the letter led Detective King to a rooming house at 200 East 52nd Street in Manhattan. The landlady, Mrs. Frieda Schneider, recognized the handwriting as belonging to one of her former tenants, an elderly man who had lived there briefly several months earlier. She remembered him as quiet and polite, always dressed in gray clothing and carrying himself with dignity. The former tenant had left behind a few personal belongings when he moved out, including some letters and personal papers. Among these items, investigators found additional handwriting samples that matched the letter sent to the Budd family. More importantly, they found receipts and other documents that led them to Albert Fish's current address. On December 13, 1934, Detective King and several other officers arrived at 52 Dunbar Place in Brooklyn, where Albert Fish was living with one of his sons. When they knocked on the door, Albert answered calmly, showing no surprise at their arrival. In fact, he seemed almost relieved, as if he had been expecting this moment for years. Albert Fish was a small, frail-looking man of 64, with thinning gray hair and a gentle demeanor that made him appear harmless. He was dressed, as always, in a simple gray suit that had seen better days. When Detective King identified himself and explained the reason for their visit, Albert nodded quietly and offered no resistance. "I always knew this day would come," Albert said softly as the handcuffs were placed on his wrists. "I've been waiting for you." Once in custody, Albert Fish proved to be surprisingly cooperative. He readily admitted to killing Grace Budd, providing details that matched the letter he had sent to her family. However, as his confession continued, it became clear that Grace's murder was just one of many crimes he had committed over his long and horrifying career. Albert claimed to have murdered dozens of children over a period of more than 20 years. He provided names, dates, and locations, describing his crimes in clinical detail that both fascinated and horrified his interrogators. Some of his claims could be verified through police records, while others involved victims who had never been reported missing or whose disappearances had never been linked to a single perpetrator. The confession revealed the full extent of Albert's psychological disturbance. He described elaborate rituals involving torture, sexual assault, and cannibalism. He spoke of hearing voices that commanded him to kill and of visions that showed him future victims. He claimed to have special powers that allowed him to identify children who deserved to die, though his criteria for making these determinations seemed entirely random. Albert's confession also revealed his belief that his crimes were religiously motivated. He claimed to be following divine commands, punishing sinful children on behalf of God. He had developed an elaborate theological framework to justify his actions, complete with biblical quotations and references to obscure religious texts. This religious mania had been a driving force throughout his criminal career, providing him with the moral justification he needed to continue killing. Albert Fish's trial began on March 11, 1935, and immediately became a media sensation. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious spectators, and members of the public who had been following the case since Grace Budd's disappearance. The proceedings were unlike anything that had been seen in an American courtroom, as the full extent of Albert's crimes and mental illness was revealed to the public. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Thomas Dewey, painted Albert Fish as a cold-blooded killer who had preyed on innocent children for decades. They presented evidence of his carefully planned crimes, his sophisticated methods of avoiding detection, and his complete lack of remorse for his actions. The prosecution argued that Albert was legally sane and fully responsible for his crimes, despite his obvious mental illness. The defense, led by attorney James Dempsey, faced an almost impossible task. Their client had confessed to multiple murders and showed no remorse for his actions. Their only hope was to prove that Albert was legally insane and therefore not responsible for his crimes. They brought in psychiatrists and psychologists to testify about Albert's mental condition, arguing that his religious delusions and sexual perversions made it impossible for him to distinguish right from wrong. The trial featured testimony from some of the leading psychiatrists of the era who examined Albert's mental condition in detail. Dr. Frederick Wortham, a prominent psychiatrist who had examined Albert extensively, testified that he was suffering from multiple mental disorders that had completely destroyed his ability to function as a rational human being. He described Albert as a psychiatric phenomenon, whose combination of disorders was unlike anything he had ever encountered. However, other psychiatric experts disagreed with Dr. Wortham's assessment. They argued that while Albert was clearly mentally ill, he was still capable of understanding the difference between right and wrong. They pointed to his careful planning of his crimes, his ability to avoid detection for decades, and his use of false identities as evidence that he was legally sane. One of the most disturbing aspects of Albert Fish's trial was the revelation of the extent to which he had mutilated his own body over the years. Medical examinations revealed that Albert had inserted dozens of needles into his body, particularly around his genitals and lower abdomen. X-rays showed that many of these needles had become embedded so deeply that they could not be removed without surgery. The medical evidence provided shocking insight into Albert's psychological condition. He had been systematically torturing himself for decades, finding sexual pleasure in the pain he inflicted on his own body. This self-mutilation had escalated over time, with Albert developing increasingly creative and painful methods of satisfying his masochistic desires. Albert also suffered from numerous untreated medical conditions that may have contributed to his mental illness. He had contracted syphilis during his younger years, and the disease had gone untreated for decades. Medical experts suggested that the neurological damage caused by advanced syphilis may have contributed to his delusions and violent behavior. The examination also revealed evidence of Albert's cannibalistic activities. Chemical analysis of his stomach contents and dental records provided evidence that he had indeed consumed human flesh, as he had claimed in his confessions. This physical evidence corroborated his horrifying claims about eating his victims, removing any doubt about the veracity of his confessions. After deliberating for just 4 hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all charges. They rejected the defense's claim of insanity, determining that Albert Fish was legally responsible for his crimes despite his obvious mental illness. The judge sentenced him to death by electrocution, and Albert was transferred to Sing Sing prison to await his execution. Albert's time on death row was marked by continued bizarre behavior and religious delusions. He claimed to have prophetic visions about his execution, predicting that he would survive the electric chair through divine intervention. He spent his time writing letters to newspapers and government officials, describing his crimes in graphic detail and expressing no remorse for his actions. On January 16, 1936, Albert Fish was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. Witnesses reported that he appeared calm and even excited as he was strapped into the chair, claiming that his death would be the supreme thrill of his life. His final words were reportedly, "I don't even know why I'm here," though some accounts suggest he remained silent until the end. Albert's execution brought closure to the families of his victims, particularly the Budd family, who had waited more than 7 years for justice. However, questions remained about the full extent of his crimes and whether all of his victims had been identified. Investigators continued to work on cases that might have been connected to Albert Fish for years after his death, but many of these investigations remained inconclusive. The case of Albert Fish had a profound impact on American law enforcement and criminal psychology. His crimes demonstrated the need for better coordination between police departments in different jurisdictions, as his ability to move freely between states had allowed him to avoid detection for decades. The investigation also highlighted the importance of maintaining detailed records of missing persons cases and sharing information between agencies. Albert Fish's case also contributed to the development of modern criminal profiling techniques. His distinctive behavioral patterns and psychological profile provided valuable insights that would later be used to identify and capture other serial killers. The detailed psychiatric evaluations conducted during his trial became important reference materials for future cases involving mentally ill criminals. The media coverage of Albert Fish's trial and execution also marked a turning point in how American society dealt with extreme criminal cases. The graphic details of his crimes were widely reported in newspapers and magazines, sparking debates about the appropriate level of coverage for such disturbing material. These discussions would continue to influence media coverage of serial killer cases for decades to come. Perhaps most importantly, the Albert Fish case served as a stark reminder of the capacity for human evil and the importance of protecting society's most vulnerable members. His crimes against children shocked the nation and led to increased awareness of child safety issues. The case continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk behind seemingly harmless facades. The gray man's reign of terror may have ended in 1936, but his legacy continues to haunt the American consciousness. Albert Fish remains one of the most disturbing and incomprehensible figures in the history of American crime, a reminder that true evil can sometimes wear the most innocent face. Story 3, Fields of Death, the Juan Corona Murders. In the scorching heat of California's Central Valley, beneath the endless rows of peach trees and agricultural fields that feed America, lies one of the most disturbing chapters in the annals of serial murder. The story of Juan Corona is not just about a man who killed 25 people, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history at the time. It is a tale that exposes the dark underbelly of migrant labor, the vulnerability of society's forgotten people, and how evil can flourish in plain sight among the most ordinary of circumstances. The year was 1971, and the small farming community of Yuba City, California, seemed like an unlikely setting for mass murder. Located about 40 miles north of Sacramento, this agricultural hub was home to sprawling orchards and farms that relied heavily on seasonal migrant workers. These men, mostly drifters and laborers, would arrive each season looking for work, living in makeshift camps and cheap boarding houses, existing on the margins of society where few people would notice if they disappeared. It was in this world of temporary workers and transient lives that Juan Corona operated his labor contracting business. To the outside world, he appeared to be a successful entrepreneur who had achieved the American dream. Born in Mexico, Corona had immigrated to the United States and built a thriving business that supplied farm workers to local growers. He was married with 4 daughters, owned a home, and was respected in the community. But beneath this facade of respectability lurked a monster whose crimes would shock the nation. The first hint that something was terribly wrong came on May 19, 1971, when a Japanese-American peach farmer named Goro Kagehiro discovered something disturbing in one of his orchards. While checking his trees, he noticed that the soil in one area appeared to have been recently disturbed. Upon closer inspection, he found what appeared to be a shallow grave. When police arrived and began excavating, they uncovered the body of Kenneth Whitaker, a 67-year-old transient who had been brutally murdered. The discovery of Whitaker's body might have been dismissed as an isolated incident, perhaps the result of a dispute among the migrant workers or a robbery gone wrong. However, the methodical way the body had been buried, wrapped in a sleeping bag and placed in a carefully dug grave, suggested something more sinister. The victim had suffered massive head trauma from what appeared to be a machete or similar bladed weapon, indicating a level of brutality that went beyond a simple robbery or assault. Detective Roy Whitaker of the Sutter County Sheriff's Office was assigned to investigate the case. A veteran investigator with over 20 years of experience, Whitaker had seen his share of violent crimes, but something about this case troubled him. The location of the burial, the manner in which the body had been disposed of, and the victim's profile as a transient worker all suggested that this might not be an isolated incident. Whitaker's instincts proved correct when, just days after the first discovery, another body was found in a nearby orchard. This victim, Charles Fleming, was also a migrant worker who had been killed in a similar manner and buried in a shallow grave. The similarities between the 2 murders were too striking to be coincidental. Both victims had suffered severe head trauma, both had been buried in agricultural fields, and both were transient workers who might not be missed for weeks or months. As news of the murder spread through the farming community, other growers began to report that some of their seasonal workers had simply disappeared without collecting their final paychecks. This was unusual, as even the most unreliable workers typically stayed long enough to get paid before moving on to the next job. The realization that multiple workers had vanished prompted a massive search of the agricultural areas around Yuba City. What investigators discovered over the following weeks would horrify the nation. One by one, shallow graves were uncovered in orchards and fields throughout the area. Each contained the remains of migrant workers who had been systematically murdered and buried. The victims had all suffered similar injuries, primarily massive head trauma inflicted with a machete-like weapon. Many also showed signs of sexual assault, adding another disturbing dimension to the crimes. The investigation revealed a pattern that painted a chilling picture of predatory behavior. The victims were all vulnerable men, mostly middle-aged transients who had few family ties and whose disappearances would not be immediately noticed. They had all been seeking work through labor contractors, making them dependent on intermediaries like Juan Corona for employment opportunities. This relationship gave Corona access to potential victims and the trust necessary to lure them to isolated locations. As the body count mounted, reaching 25 confirmed victims, by the time the investigation was complete, attention focused on Juan Corona. Several pieces of evidence linked him to the crimes. Receipts with his name on them were found with some of the bodies, and witnesses reported seeing victims in his company shortly before they disappeared. Most damning was the discovery of a machete in Corona's possession that appeared to match the weapon used in the murders. The investigation into Corona's background revealed a man whose life had been marked by mental health issues and violent behavior. He had previously been hospitalized for psychiatric treatment after attacking several people with a machete in 1970. During that incident, he had claimed that people were trying to harm him and his family, displaying symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia. Despite this history of violence and mental illness, he had been released and allowed to return to his business of labor contracting. Corona's mental state became a central issue in understanding his crimes. Psychiatric evaluations suggested that he suffered from severe mental illness, possibly including schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder. Some experts theorize that his delusions may have led him to view his victims as threats that needed to be eliminated. Others suggested that his crimes were motivated by a combination of sexual sadism and a desire for power and control over vulnerable individuals. The trial of Juan Corona began in 1972 and became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings of the decade. The prosecution painted a picture of a methodical killer who had used his position as a labor contractor to identify and access victims. They argued that Corona had lured workers to isolated locations under the pretense of offering them work, then murdered them for reasons that remained unclear, but likely involved a combination of sexual violence and psychological gratification. The defense team, led by attorney Richard Hawke, argued that Corona was mentally ill and therefore not responsible for his actions. They presented evidence of his psychiatric history and argued that his severe mental illness had rendered him incapable of understanding the nature and consequences of his acts. The defense also suggested that Corona might not have been the actual killer, proposing that his brother Natividad, who had also been involved in violent incidents, might have been responsible for some or all of the murders. The prosecution's case was built on a combination of physical evidence and circumstantial evidence that linked Corona to the victims and crime scenes. This included the receipts found with bodies, witness testimony placing him with victims shortly before their disappearances, and the discovery of weapons in his possession that matched those used in the murders. Perhaps most compelling was the sheer scope of the crimes and the systematic way in which they had been carried out, suggesting an organized killer rather than random acts of violence. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Corona case was how long the murders had apparently been going on without detection. Investigators estimated that the killing spree had lasted for several years, with victims being murdered and buried at a rate of several per year. The fact that so many people could disappear without anyone noticing highlighted the vulnerability of migrant workers and the indifference of society toward their welfare. The victims of Juan Corona were not just statistics in a criminal case. They were human beings with their own stories and dreams. Many had come to California seeking honest work and a chance for a better life. Some were family men who sent money home to support wives and children. Others were loners who had been dealt hard blows by life, but were still trying to survive with dignity. All of them deserved better than to end up in unmarked graves in anonymous orchards. The trial lasted several months and featured testimony from dozens of witnesses, including forensic experts, psychiatric specialists, and people who had known both Corona and his victims. The jury was faced with the difficult task of determining not only whether Corona was guilty of the murders, but also whether he was mentally competent to stand trial and understand the proceedings against him. In February 1973, after deliberating for 45 hours over 8 days, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all 25 counts of first-degree murder. Corona was sentenced to 25 consecutive life terms in prison, making him eligible for parole only after serving 25 years. The verdict was seen as vindication for the victims and their families, but it also raised questions about how such a massive killing spree could have gone undetected for so long. The Corona case had far-reaching implications beyond the courtroom. It exposed the dangerous working conditions and vulnerability of migrant agricultural workers, leading to calls for better protection and oversight of labor practices. The case also highlighted the need for better mental health screening and treatment, as Corona's psychiatric history had been known but inadequately addressed before he began killing. Following his conviction, Corona's case continued to generate controversy and legal challenges. His attorneys filed numerous appeals, arguing that he had not received adequate legal representation and that his mental illness had not been properly considered during the trial. In 1978, a federal appeals court overturned his conviction, ruling that his defense attorney had been ineffective. This led to a second trial in 1982, where Corona was again convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison. The second trial provided additional insights into Corona's psychological state and motivations. Expert witnesses testified about the nature of his mental illness and how it might have contributed to his violent behavior. The prosecution argued that regardless of his mental state, Corona had demonstrated the ability to plan and carry out complex crimes over an extended period, suggesting that he retained enough mental capacity to be held responsible for his actions. During his years in prison, Corona maintained his innocence, claiming that he had been framed for crimes committed by others. He suggested that his brother Natividad, who had died before the trial, was the actual killer. However, he never provided credible evidence to support these claims, and investigators remained convinced that they had identified and convicted the right perpetrator. The psychological profile that emerged from the Corona case helped criminologists better understand the motivations and methods of serial killers who target vulnerable populations. Unlike killers who seek media attention or leave elaborate calling cards, Corona appeared to have chosen victims specifically because they would not be missed. This predatory behavior, combined with his access to potential victims through his labor-contracting business, created the perfect conditions for a prolonged killing spree. The case also illustrated how mental illness can manifest in violent criminal behavior, while raising complex questions about the relationship between psychological disorders and criminal responsibility. Corona's psychiatric history provided insight into his deteriorating mental state, but it also demonstrated the challenges faced by the legal system in dealing with mentally ill defendants who have committed serious crimes. For the farming community of Yuba City and the surrounding areas, the Corona murders left lasting scars. The discovery that such extensive violence had been occurring in their midst shattered the community's sense of security and trust. Many residents struggled to understand how someone they had known and done business with could have been capable of such horrific crimes. The impact on the migrant worker community was particularly severe. Already marginalized and vulnerable, these workers now faced additional suspicion and fear from employers and community members. The murders highlighted the precarious existence of seasonal agricultural workers and the need for better protection and support services for this population. Law enforcement agencies also learned valuable lessons from the Corona case. The investigation demonstrated the importance of coordination between different jurisdictions and the need for better systems to track missing persons, particularly among transient populations. The case helped establish protocols for handling mass murder investigations and highlighted the challenges of investigating crimes involving victims who have few social connections. The Corona murders occurred during a period when public awareness of serial killing was beginning to emerge, several years before cases like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy would capture national headlines. In many ways, the Corona case helped educate law enforcement and the public about the reality of serial murder and the need for more sophisticated investigative techniques. Modern criminal profilers still study the Corona case as an example of how serial killers can operate within specific occupational or social contexts. His use of his legitimate business as a means of accessing victims represents a pattern that has been observed in other cases, where killers exploit positions of trust or authority to identify and approach potential victims. The forensic evidence collection and analysis in the Corona case also provided valuable experience for investigators dealing with mass murder scenes. The systematic excavation of multiple burial sites and the careful documentation of evidence helped establish best practices that are still used today in similar investigations. Juan Corona died in prison in 2019 at the age of 85, having served nearly 50 years behind bars. He never admitted guilt for the murders and maintained his innocence until his death. His passing marked the end of one of California's most notorious criminal cases, but the impact of his crimes continues to reverberate through the communities and families affected by his actions. The legacy of the Corona murders extends beyond the specific crimes to broader questions about social responsibility, mental health care, and the protection of vulnerable populations. The case serves as a reminder that evil can flourish in the most ordinary settings when society fails to adequately protect its most vulnerable members. Today, the orchards and fields where Corona buried his victims continue to produce crops, but the memory of what happened there remains. Memorials and markers have been placed at some of the locations where bodies were found, serving as reminders of the lives that were lost and the importance of never forgetting the victims of violent crime. The story of Juan Corona is ultimately a cautionary tale about the capacity for evil that can exist alongside apparent normalcy and respectability. It reminds us that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most ordinary, who use positions of trust and authority to access and victimize the most vulnerable members of society. In the fields of California's Central Valley, where the earth once concealed the evidence of unspeakable crimes, the memory of Juan Corona's victims serves as a testament to the importance of vigilance, compassion, and justice for all. Story 4. Belle Gunness, the Black Widow of Murder Farm. In the misty farmlands of LaPorte, Indiana, at the dawn of the 20th century, there stood a modest white farmhouse that would become synonymous with one of America's most chilling tales of serial murder. The woman who owned this property was Belle Gunness, a seemingly ordinary Norwegian immigrant who would earn the terrifying moniker, the Black Widow of Murder Farm. Belle Sorensen was born in Selbu, Norway in 1859, one of 8 children in a family struggling with poverty. She immigrated to America in 1881, carrying with her the dreams of countless others seeking a better life in the New World. Standing nearly 6 feet tall with a robust build, Belle was an imposing figure even by today's standards. Her piercing blue eyes and stern demeanor commanded attention wherever she went. After settling in Chicago, Belle married Mads Sorensen in 1884. The couple opened a confectionery shop, but their business ventures seemed plagued by mysterious misfortune. Their candy store burned down under suspicious circumstances, yielding a convenient insurance payout. When their family home also mysteriously caught fire, another insurance settlement followed. A pattern was beginning to emerge, though no one suspected the true horror that lay beneath Belle's seemingly unlucky circumstances. Tragedy struck the Sorensen household repeatedly. 2 of Belle's children died in infancy under mysterious circumstances, both conveniently insured. Then in 1900, Mads himself died suddenly on a day when 2 life insurance policies overlapped, ensuring maximum payout. The doctor initially suspected strychnine poisoning, but Belle's emotional outpouring at his funeral convinced him to change the cause of death to heart failure. Newly widowed and wealthy from insurance money, Belle purchased a 48-acre pig farm in LaPorte, Indiana in 1901. The property seemed perfect for a fresh start, isolated enough to provide privacy, yet close enough to town for convenience. She brought along her 3 remaining children and soon began advertising in Norwegian-language newspapers across the Midwest seeking a husband. Her personal advertisements painted the picture of a lonely widow seeking companionship. Personal, comely widow who owns a large farm in one of the finest districts in LaPorte County, Indiana, desires to make the acquaintance of a gentleman equally well provided, with view of joining fortunes. No replies by letter considered unless sender is willing to follow answer with personal visit. Peter Gunness, a fellow Norwegian immigrant and widower, answered her call in 1902. They married quickly, but their wedded bliss was short-lived. Within 8 months, Peter met his end when a meat grinder mysteriously fell from a high shelf, crushing his skull as he sat below. Belle claimed it was a tragic accident, sobbing inconsolably at the inquest. The coroner ruled it accidental death, though Peter's teenage daughter from his first marriage suspected foul play and left the farm immediately after the funeral. Now twice widowed, Belle continued her deadly charade with renewed vigor. She placed more advertisements, each one carefully crafted to attract wealthy, lonely men seeking love and companionship. The responses poured in from across the country. Men traveled hundreds of miles to meet the mysterious widow who promised love, marriage, and a prosperous life together. Andrew Helgelian arrived from South Dakota in January 1908, carrying with him his life savings of nearly $3,000, as Belle had requested to prove his financial worthiness. Neighbors reported seeing him working around the farm for several days before he vanished completely. When his brother Assel grew concerned about Andrew's sudden silence, he traveled to LaPorte to investigate. Belle initially claimed Andrew had left unexpectedly, taking her money and breaking her heart, but Assel persisted, threatening to involve the authorities. Sensing danger, Belle began making preparations to disappear. She visited her lawyer, updating her will and liquidating assets. She withdrew money from banks and made arrangements that suggested permanent departure. On April 28, 1908, The Gunnis farmhouse was consumed by flames in the early morning hours. Investigators discovered 4 bodies in the basement, 3 children and a headless adult female corpse. The head was never found, leading to speculation about the true identity of the 4th victim. While the body was similar in size to Belle, some details didn't match, including the discovery of false teeth that Belle had never worn. As investigators excavated the property, they uncovered a chamber of horrors that shocked even seasoned law enforcement officers. Buried throughout the grounds were the dismembered remains of at least 12 victims, though some estimates suggest the number could have been much higher. The bodies were found in various states of decomposition, some wrapped in oilcloth, others simply buried in shallow graves. Among the identified victims were Norwegian immigrants who had traveled to Laporte seeking love, Swedish farmhands who had worked the property, and even local acquaintances who had gotten too close to Belle's secrets. The remains of Andrew Helgelien were found buried near the hog pen, along with several other unidentified men who had likely answered Belle's matrimonial advertisements. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community and captured national attention. Newspapers dubbed the property Murder Farm, and Belle became known as the Black Widow for her method of attracting and killing potential husbands. The case became one of America's first widely publicized serial murder investigations, drawing curious onlookers and reporters from across the country. Ray Lamphere, a farmhand who had worked for Belle, was arrested and charged with arson and murder. During his trial, prosecutors painted him as an accomplice who had helped Belle lure victims and dispose of bodies. Lamphere maintained his innocence regarding the murders, claiming Belle had acted alone, but he was convicted of arson and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Before his death in 1909, Lamphere allegedly confessed to the prison chaplain that Belle had indeed escaped the fire alive. According to his account, she had murdered the housekeeper and her children, decapitated the woman, and placed the body in her own bed before setting the house ablaze. He claimed she had prepared her escape carefully, arranging for fake identification and a new life elsewhere. Reported sightings of Belle Gunnis surfaced for years afterward. Some claimed to have seen her in Chicago, others in California, and still more in various small towns across the Midwest. A woman matching her description was allegedly spotted in Los Angeles in 1931. But her true fate remains one of America's most enduring mysteries. The exact number of Belle's victims may never be known. Estimates range from 12 confirmed deaths to possibly more than 40 murders spanning over 2 decades. Her method was consistently calculated and cruel. She would attract victims through personal advertisements, gain their trust and access to their money, then dispose of them when they were no longer useful. What made Belle Gunnis particularly terrifying was her ability to blend into society as a respectable widow while conducting her murderous activities. She attended church regularly, was known in the community as a devoted mother, and maintained the appearance of a woman struggling to make an honest living on her farm. This facade allowed her to continue killing for years without serious suspicion. The psychology behind Belle's crimes has fascinated criminologists for over a century. Unlike many serial killers driven by psychological compulsion, Belle appeared motivated primarily by financial gain. She was methodical, patient, and remarkably successful at avoiding detection. Her crimes were business ventures, with murder simply being the cost of doing business. The Belle Gunnis case marked a significant moment in American criminal history. It was among the first serial murder cases to receive extensive newspaper coverage, and it helped establish many of the investigative techniques still used today. The systematic excavation of her property and the careful documentation of evidence set precedents for future investigations. The story of Murder Farm continues to captivate true crime enthusiasts more than a century later. The isolated farmhouse where so many met their fate has become a symbol of hidden evil lurking beneath the surface of ordinary American life. Belle Gunnis proved that monsters don't always hide in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. Sometimes they live in plain sight, tending gardens and raising children while planning their next kill. Story 5. H. Holmes, America's first serial killer. As the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition transformed Chicago into a gleaming showcase of American progress and innovation, a different kind of spectacle was taking place just a few miles away. In the Englewood neighborhood, a charming and intelligent man named Herman Webster Mudgett, operating under the alias Dr. H. Holmes, was constructing what would become known as America's first murder castle. Holmes was born in 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, into a devoutly Methodist family. From an early age, he displayed an unusual fascination with death and anatomy. Local legends claim that childhood bullies once forced him to confront a human skeleton in a doctor's office, an experience that supposedly sparked rather than traumatized him. Whether true or not, Holmes would later claim this encounter ignited his lifelong obsession with the human body and its mortality. Exceptionally intelligent and charismatic, Holmes excelled academically and eventually enrolled at the University of Vermont before transferring to the University of Michigan Medical School. It was here that his true nature began to emerge. Holmes discovered that he could steal cadavers from the medical school laboratory, disfigure them to make identification difficult, and then claim life insurance policies on fictitious identities. This early foray into insurance fraud would become a hallmark of his criminal career. After graduating in 1884, Holmes moved to Chicago, drawn by the opportunities presented by the rapidly growing city. He initially worked at a pharmacy in Englewood, owned by Dr. Elizabeth Holton. When Dr. Holton mysteriously disappeared, Holmes claimed she had sold the business to him and moved to California. Neighbors never saw her leave, but Holmes's charm and apparent legitimacy convinced them to accept his explanation. With the World's Fair approaching and property values rising, Holmes saw an opportunity. He purchased a lot across from his pharmacy and began construction of what appeared to be a three-story hotel designed to house visitors to the exposition. However, Holmes had much darker intentions for his building, which would later be dubbed the Murder Castle. The construction of Holmes's hotel was deliberately chaotic and suspicious. He frequently changed architects and contractors, never allowing any single person to understand the complete layout of the building. Workers who asked too many questions often disappeared or were fired abruptly. Holmes claimed this was to keep construction costs down, but the reality was far more sinister. The finished building was a maze of confusion and death. The first floor housed Holmes's pharmacy and various shops, presenting a normal facade to the public. The second and third floors, however, contained a labyrinth of over 100 windowless rooms, secret passages, soundproof chambers, trapdoors, and gas lines that could be controlled from Holmes's private office. Some rooms were equipped with gas jets that could be turned on remotely, allowing Holmes to asphyxiate victims from a distance. Others contained acid baths and lime pits designed to dispose of bodies. A specially constructed kiln in the basement could incinerate human remains, while a dissection table allowed Holmes to practice his medical skills on his victims. Chutes connected various floors, providing easy disposal of bodies to the basement. The most chilling aspect of the murder castle was how normal it appeared to most visitors. Holmes rented rooms to guests, particularly young women attracted to Chicago for the World's Fair. He was charming, well-dressed, and appeared to be a successful businessman and doctor. His blue eyes and confident demeanor made him attractive to many women, who saw him as a potential husband or employer. Holmes's method was to gain the trust of his victims before exploiting their vulnerabilities. He often hired young women as secretaries or shop assistants, requiring them to take out life insurance policies, naming him as beneficiary. Once the paperwork was complete, the women would mysteriously disappear. Holmes would claim they had quit suddenly or returned home to family emergencies. Among his confirmed victims was Julia Smythe, who worked in Holmes's pharmacy. After her husband became suspicious of Holmes's intentions toward his wife, he confronted the doctor. Shortly afterward, both husband and wife disappeared. Holmes claimed that they had moved to California, but their bodies were later found in the castle's basement. Their young daughter Pearl also vanished, though her fate remains uncertain. Another victim was Emmeline Sigrand, a young woman from Indiana who came to Chicago seeking work. Holmes hired her as a stenographer and quickly began courting her. When she wrote to her family about her engagement to a wonderful doctor, they were pleased for her future. Her letters stopped abruptly, and she was never seen alive again. Holmes told inquiring friends that she had died of consumption and had been buried quietly according to her wishes. The World's Fair of 1893 provided Holmes with a steady stream of potential victims. Young women from across the country came to Chicago seeking employment and adventure. Many stayed at Holmes's hotel, attracted by the reasonable rates and the proprietor's apparent respectability. Few who entered certain rooms ever left alive. Holmes's crimes weren't limited to murder. He ran elaborate insurance fraud schemes, sold fraudulent real estate, and operated various confidence games. His charm and intelligence allowed him to maintain multiple identities and romantic relationships simultaneously. He was married to at least 3 women at the same time, none of whom knew about the others. The beginning of the end came when Holmes's financial schemes began to unravel. Creditors were closing in, and several insurance companies had become suspicious of the numerous claims associated with his businesses. In 1894, facing mounting legal pressure, Holmes abandoned his murder castle and fled Chicago. He traveled to Fort Worth, Texas, where he attempted to replicate his Chicago success by constructing another building designed for murder. However, this project was never completed, as Holmes was forced to continue running from his mounting legal troubles. He eventually partnered with convicted train robber Marion Hedgepeth in a complex insurance fraud scheme. The scheme involved faking the death of Holmes's associate Benjamin Pitzel and collecting on his life insurance policy. However, Holmes actually murdered Pitzel and continued collecting insurance money while claiming to help hide Pitzel's living family from insurance investigators. Holmes killed 3 of Pitzel's children during this period, keeping their bodies in various locations while continuing his deception. Holmes's downfall came when his pattern of lies became too complex to maintain. Marion Hedgepeth, feeling cheated out of his share of the insurance money, informed authorities about Holmes's fraudulent activities. A nationwide manhunt ensued, and Holmes was finally arrested in Philadelphia in 1894. The subsequent investigation revealed the true horror of Holmes's murder castle. When authorities searched the building, they found evidence of numerous murders, though the exact number of victims remains unknown. Estimates range from 27 confirmed deaths to possibly over 200 murders. The building's complex layout and Holmes's systematic destruction of evidence made it impossible to determine the full extent of his crimes. During his trial, Holmes alternately confessed to and denied various murders. He seemed to enjoy the attention and notoriety his case generated. The press dubbed him America's first serial killer, and his story captured the nation's imagination. The contrast between his charming exterior and monstrous crimes became a template for public fascination with serial killers that continues today. Holmes was executed by hanging in Philadelphia on May 7, 1896. Even in death, he remained manipulative, claiming in his final confession to have killed 27 people, though he later recanted portions of this confession. He also claimed that his face had begun to resemble that of the devil, a statement that only added to his infamy. The murder castle itself became a macabre tourist attraction after Holmes's arrest. Visitors would pay to tour the building and see where the infamous murders had taken place. However, the building was largely destroyed by a mysterious fire in 1895, eliminating much of the physical evidence of Holmes's crimes. The case of H. Holmes marked a turning point in American criminal history. It was one of the first cases to receive extensive nationwide newspaper coverage, and it introduced the public to the concept of the serial killer. Holmes's combination of charm, intelligence, and methodical cruelty became the archetype for fictional villains and real criminals alike. Modern criminal profilers study Holmes as an early example of the organized serial killer. His ability to maintain a normal public persona while systematically murdering victims demonstrated a level of psychological complexity that challenged contemporary understanding of criminal behavior. His case helped establish many investigative techniques still used today in serial killer investigations. The story of H. Holmes and his murder castle continues to fascinate true crime enthusiasts and researchers. His crimes occurred during a pivotal moment in American history as the country was transforming from a rural, agricultural society to an urban, industrial one. Holmes represented the dark side of this transformation, showing how anonymity and rapid social change could provide cover for unprecedented evil. Story 6. Ed Gein, the Butcher of Plainfield. In the remote farmlands of central Wisconsin, where endless cornfields stretched toward distant horizons and neighbors might live miles apart, there stood a weathered farmhouse that would become the epicenter of one of America's most disturbing criminal cases. The man who lived in this decaying structure was Edward Theodore Gein, a quiet, unassuming figure who would inspire some of the most terrifying fictional characters in American culture. Ed Gein was born in 1906 in La Crosse County, Wisconsin, to George and Augusta Gein. His father was an alcoholic who struggled to maintain steady employment, while his mother, Augusta, was a deeply religious woman with an intense hatred of the outside world, particularly men and alcohol. Augusta viewed the world as a place of sin and corruption, beliefs she imposed upon her two sons with fanatical devotion. The Gain family moved to a 160-acre farm outside the small town of Plainfield when Ed was young. Augusta chose this isolated location specifically to keep her family away from what she perceived as the corrupting influences of society. She homeschooled her sons and rarely allowed them to interact with other children, creating an insular world where her religious extremism and paranoid worldview went unchallenged. Augusta's relationship with her sons was complex and deeply disturbing. She simultaneously expressed love for them while filling their minds with horror stories about the sins of the flesh and the evil nature of women. She particularly focused on Ed, the younger and more impressionable of her two sons, creating a psychological dependence that would define his entire life. Ed's older brother Henry occasionally questioned their mother's extreme views and made attempts to introduce Ed to a more normal social life. However, Henry died in 1944 under suspicious circumstances during a brush fire on the family property. While Ed claimed they had become separated while fighting the fire, he was able to lead authorities directly to Henry's body in an area that hadn't been burned. Despite evidence of blunt force trauma to Henry's head, his death was ruled accidental. When Augusta suffered a stroke in 1945, Ed became her devoted caretaker. He abandoned any pretense of independence and dedicated himself entirely to nursing his mother back to health. Augusta partially recovered, but suffered a second stroke that same year. On December 29, 1945, Augusta Gein died, leaving Ed completely alone for the first time in his 39 years of life. Augusta's death devastated Ed in ways that went far beyond normal grief. He had lost the only person who had ever given meaning to his existence, however twisted that relationship had been. Without her constant presence and domination, Ed began to retreat into a fantasy world that blurred the lines between life and death, love and horror. After his mother's death, Ed sealed off the rooms that Augusta had used, preserving them exactly as they had been on the day she died. He confined himself to a small section of the farmhouse, living in increasingly squalid conditions while maintaining his mother's rooms as a shrine to her memory. The house began to deteriorate around him, but Ed seemed oblivious to the decay. During the day, Ed maintained a relatively normal facade. He worked as a handyman for neighbors, helped local farmers with seasonal work, and occasionally visited the town of Plainfield for supplies. Townspeople remember him as quiet and somewhat odd, but not threatening. He had a peculiar habit of laughing at inappropriate times and would sometimes make strange comments, but most attributed this to his sheltered upbringing and social awkwardness. However, Ed's nighttime activities told a different story. He began making regular visits to local cemeteries, particularly during times when recent burials had taken place. Initially, he claimed later, he would simply dig up graves and examine the bodies, driven by a morbid curiosity about death and decay. These nocturnal expeditions became a regular part of his routine. As Ed's mental state continued to deteriorate, his grave-robbing activities escalated. He began taking body parts home with him, initially claiming he wanted to study human anatomy. However, his true motivation was far more disturbing. Ed had become obsessed with the idea of literally becoming a woman, specifically becoming his mother. He began fashioning clothing and accessories from human skin and body parts. Ed's workshop in the farmhouse became a grotesque laboratory where he would tan human skin, craft masks from human faces, and create various items from body parts. He fashioned a vest from a woman's torso, complete with breasts. He made masks from the faces of middle-aged women who resembled his mother. Most disturbing of all, he created what he called his woman's suit, a complete outfit made from human skin that he would wear while pretending to be his mother. The distinction between grave robbing and murder became blurred in Ed's mind. On November 16, 1957, Bernice Warden, who operated a hardware store in Plainfield, disappeared. Her son Frank, who was a deputy sheriff, became concerned when he arrived at the store to find it closed with signs of a struggle. The cash register was missing, and there were bloodstains on the floor. Frank Warden remembered that Ed Gein had been in the store the previous evening and had made comments about returning when Bernice would be alone. Ed had also purchased antifreeze, which seemed odd since he didn't own a car. Based on this information and other circumstantial evidence, authorities decided to search the Gein farmhouse. What they discovered defied belief and challenged the sanity of even experienced law enforcement officers. In the summer kitchen, they found Bernice Warden's headless, gutted corpse hanging upside down from the ceiling, dressed like a deer carcass. Her head was found in a burlap bag, along with her heart in a paper bag. As investigators continued their search, they uncovered a house of horrors that surpassed the worst imagination could conjure. They found bowls made from human skulls, chairs upholstered with human skin, lampshades crafted from faces, a shoebox containing 9 masks made from women's faces, fingernails, a pair of lips on a window shade drawstring, and numerous other items fashioned from human remains. 10 skulls were discovered throughout the house, some with the tops sawed off and used as bowls. 4 noses were found in a cup. A heart was discovered in a bag. Most disturbing of all was the complete woman's suit made from human skin, including a vest with breasts, leggings, and female genitalia. Ed had apparently worn this grotesque costume while impersonating his mother. The investigation also revealed evidence linking Ed to the disappearance of Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who had vanished 3 years earlier. Her head was found among Ed's collection, and ballistics tests confirmed that she had been shot with a rifle found in the Gein house. During his interrogation, Ed was surprisingly cooperative and matter-of-fact about his crimes. He spoke about his activities with the same tone one might use to discuss gardening or woodworking. He explained his grave-robbing expeditions in detail and admitted to killing both Bernice Warden and Mary Hogan. However, he insisted that these were his only murders, claiming that his other body parts had been obtained from graves. Ed's motives, as he explained them, were rooted in his desire to become a woman and to be reunited with his mother. He believed that by wearing the skin of women who resembled Augusta, he could somehow transform himself and bring her back. This delusion had driven him to increasingly extreme behavior over the course of more than a decade. The case shocked the nation and forever changed the small town of Plainfield. Media from around the world descended on the community, turning Ed's farmhouse into a macabre tourist attraction. The house itself was eventually burned down by unknown arsonists. Though Ed's 1949 Ford sedan was sold at auction and toured the country as a sideshow attraction, Ed Gein was found mentally incompetent to stand trial and was committed to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. He spent the next 10 years receiving psychiatric treatment before being deemed fit for trial. In 1968, he was tried for the murder of Bernice Warden and found guilty but criminally insane. He was returned to the mental hospital where he remained for the rest of his life. During his years in the mental hospital, Ed became a model patient. He was quiet, cooperative, and showed genuine remorse for his crimes. He worked in the hospital kitchen and maintained a small garden. Psychiatrists found him to be intelligent and articulate when discussing topics other than his crimes. He died of lung cancer on July 26, 1984, at the age of 77. The impact of Ed Gein's crimes on American culture cannot be overstated. His case inspired numerous fictional characters, including Norman Bates in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. These characters brought Ed's particular brand of horror into mainstream entertainment, ensuring that his legacy would continue to terrify generations. The case also had a profound impact on the field of criminal psychology. Ed represented a new type of criminal that psychiatrists and law enforcement had never encountered. His combination of necrophilia, cannibalism, and transvestism, combined with his ability to function normally in society, challenged existing understanding of mental illness and criminal behavior. Ed Gein's story serves as a chilling reminder of how isolation, mental illness, and childhood trauma can combine to create monsters. His crimes were not motivated by the typical reasons behind murder, money, revenge, or passion, but by a twisted psychological need that defied rational explanation. The quiet farmer who seemed so harmless to his neighbors had created a world of horror that shocked even experienced investigators. The farmhouse where Ed committed his crimes is long gone, but the memory of what happened there continues to haunt the American imagination. In a small Wisconsin town where everyone knew everyone else, a man lived among them for years while engaging in activities that challenged the very concept of humanity. Ed Gein proved that the most terrifying monsters are often hiding in plain sight, wearing the mask of normalcy while harboring unimaginable darkness within. Story 7, The Room, 237. The rain drummed against the windows of the Grandview Hotel like fingertips tapping an anxious rhythm. Detective Sarah Chen pulled her coat tighter as she approached the ornate entrance, its brass fixtures dulled by decades of use. The hotel had seen better days, much better days, but it still carried an air of faded elegance that made it popular with travelers seeking character over luxury. The call had come in at 3:47 a.m. A guest had vanished from a locked room on the second floor. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, no explanation. Just an empty room and a mystery that would consume the next 3 days of Sarah's life. The hotel manager, a nervous man named Gerald Brewster, met her in the lobby. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie, and beads of perspiration dotted his forehead despite the cool autumn air flowing through the entrance. "Detective Chen, thank you for coming so quickly," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been managing this hotel for 15 years, and nothing like this has ever happened. Nothing even close." Sarah nodded, pulling out her notebook. "Tell me about the guest." "Marcus Holloway. He checked in 3 days ago. Quiet man, maybe mid-40s, well-dressed. Paid cash for a week's stay. Said he was here on business, but he didn't seem like a businessman, if you know what I mean." "What did he seem like?" Gerald paused, considering his words carefully. "Like someone who was running from something, or maybe running towards something. He had this way of looking over his shoulder, even when he was just walking through the lobby. And his eyes, they were always moving, always watching." They rode the elevator to the second floor in silence. The hallway was narrow, lined with burgundy carpet that had seen countless footsteps over the decades. Room 237 was at the end of the hall, its door slightly ajar with yellow police tape stretched across the frame. Sarah ducked under the tape and examined the room. It was small but comfortable, with a single bed, a writing desk, and a window that overlooked the alley behind the hotel. The bed was unmade, suggesting Marcus had been sleeping when whatever happened occurred. His suitcase sat open on the luggage rack, clothes neatly folded inside. "The door was locked from the inside," Gerald explained. "The chain was engaged and the deadbolt was turned. I had to use the master key and then call maintenance to cut the chain." Sarah examined the window. It was painted shut and showed no signs of recent disturbance. The glass was intact, and the old paint around the frame hadn't been disturbed in years. Even if it could be opened, it was a 20-foot drop to the alley below with no fire escape or ledge. "What about the walls?" she asked, tapping on the surfaces. "Solid brick. The hotel was built in 1923. These walls are 2 feet thick in some places." Sarah continued her examination, looking for any detail that might explain how a grown man could vanish from a locked room. She found Marcus's wallet on the nightstand, containing $347 in cash, a driver's license, and a credit card. His phone was plugged in beside the bed, showing no missed calls or messages. But there was something else. On the writing desk, she found a leather journal, its pages filled with Marcus's handwriting. The entries were cryptic, almost like code. "The serpent coils tighter each day," read one entry. "They think I don't know about the warehouse on Pier 19, but I've been watching them for months. The shipments arrive every third Tuesday. Always the same truck, always the same driver." Another entry, dated just 2 days ago. "I can feel them closing in. The walls of this room feel safer than anywhere else. But I know it's an illusion. Tomorrow I make my move. If something happens to me, the evidence is hidden where only she would think to look." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. This wasn't a simple missing person case. Marcus Holloway had been investigating something dangerous, and now he was gone. She spent the next hour cataloging every item in the room, photographing everything from multiple angles. The forensics team would arrive soon, but she wanted to form her own impressions first. There was something about the scene that felt staged, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what. As she was preparing to leave, Gerald cleared his throat nervously. "Detective, there's something else. The guest in room 235, right next door, she said she heard voices around 3 a.m. Not arguing, just talking. She said it sounded like Marcus was having a conversation with someone. Did she hear what they were saying? She said most of it was too muffled to make out, but she distinctly heard Marcus say, 'I won't let you destroy more lives.' And then someone else said something about the arrangement being non-negotiable." Sarah made a note. "I'll need to speak with this guest." Mrs. Eleanor Vance was a retired librarian in her 70s, traveling alone on what she called her farewell tour of hotels she'd always wanted to visit. She was sharp and observant, the kind of witness detectives dream of finding. "I've always been a light sleeper," she explained as they sat in the hotel's small restaurant. "The voices started around 3 a.m. At first I thought maybe Marcus was on the phone, but then I realized there were definitely two people in that room." "Could you tell if it was a man or woman?" "The other voice was definitely male, deeper than Marcus's voice and with a slight accent. Not foreign, but regional, maybe from the South." "How long did the conversation last?" "About 20 minutes. Then it got quiet. Too quiet. I actually got up to check the hallway, thinking maybe they'd left, but I didn't see anyone. The next thing I knew, the manager was knocking on doors asking if anyone had seen Marcus." Sarah felt the pieces of the puzzle starting to form a picture, though it was still far from complete. Marcus had been investigating something involving a warehouse and regular shipments. He was afraid of being caught. Someone had visited him in his room in the early morning hours. After their conversation, he had vanished without a trace. The next morning, Sarah decided to investigate the warehouse Marcus had mentioned in his journal. Pier 19 was in the old industrial district, a maze of abandoned buildings and rusted shipping containers. The warehouse sat at the end of a cracked concrete road, its windows dark and empty. She parked across the street and watched the building for an hour. No activity, no signs of life. But as she was about to leave, a black sedan pulled up to the loading dock. Two men in expensive suits got out and entered through a side door. Sarah waited until they were inside, then approached the building. The windows were too high and too dirty to see through, but she could hear voices coming from within. She crept around to the loading dock and found a gap in the metal siding, just wide enough to peer through. Inside, the warehouse was divided into sections. One area contained rows of wooden crates, each stamped with shipping labels she couldn't quite read. In another section, she saw what looked like a makeshift office with filing cabinets and a large desk. The two men were examining documents, their voices echoing in the empty space. One of them had the southern accent Mrs. Vance had described. "The journalist was getting too close," the man was saying. "We couldn't let him publish what he'd found. But making him disappear like that, it's going to bring attention we don't need. It was necessary. Besides, no one will ever figure out how we did it." The room was locked from the inside, remember? As far as the police know, Marcus Holloway simply vanished into thin air. Sarah's heart raced. These men were talking about Marcus's disappearance as if they were responsible. But how had they made him vanish from a locked room? She was so focused on listening that she didn't notice the third man approaching from behind until it was too late. A hand clamped over her mouth, and she felt something hard pressed against her back. "Well, well," said a voice in her ear. "Looks like we have another curious visitor." They dragged her inside the warehouse, where the two men in suits looked up in surprise. The one with the southern accent smiled coldly. "Detective Chen, I presume. We've been expecting you." "How do you know who I am?" "We make it our business to know about anyone investigating our operations." Marcus Holloway learned that the hard way. Sarah tried to stay calm, looking for opportunities to escape. "What did you do to him?" "Nothing permanent. At least, not yet. He's simply indisposed, the same way you're about to be." The man gestured to his companions, who began moving toward her. Sarah's mind raced, trying to remember everything she'd learned about the layout of the warehouse. There had to be another way out. "You're making a mistake," she said, backing toward what she hoped was an exit. "People know where I am. If I disappear, they'll tear this place apart looking for me." "I don't think so. You see, Detective, We've been planning this for a very long time. We know exactly how to make people disappear without leaving a trace. Sarah felt the wall behind her and realized she was trapped. But as the men approached, she noticed something they had missed. A fire alarm was mounted on the wall just within reach. If she could trigger it, the sprinkler system would activate, and the noise might be enough to attract attention. She lunged for the alarm, pulling it down with all her strength. Immediately, the warehouse filled with the shriek of sirens and the spray of water from the overhead sprinklers. The men cursed and rushed toward her, but the chaos gave her the distraction she needed. She ran toward the loading dock, splashing through puddles that were already forming on the concrete floor. Behind her, she could hear the men shouting over the noise of the alarms. She burst through the door and into the daylight, not stopping until she reached her car. As she drove away, Sarah called for backup and arranged for the warehouse to be surrounded. But when the police arrived an hour later, the building was empty. The men, the crates, and any evidence of their operation were gone. However, they had left behind one important clue. In their haste to escape, they had abandoned several documents, including building plans for the Grandview Hotel. The plans showed something that wasn't visible in the current layout, a hidden passage that ran between the walls of the second floor. Sarah raced back to the hotel, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. With Gerald's help, she examined the wall behind the headboard in room 237. What had appeared to be solid brick was actually a cleverly concealed doorway. When pressed in the right sequence, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passage that led to the hotel's old service tunnels. Following the passage, Sarah found herself in a network of forgotten corridors that ran throughout the hotel's basement. The tunnels had been used by staff in the hotel's heyday, but had been sealed off and forgotten decades ago. At the end of one tunnel, she found a small room that had been recently used as a makeshift prison. Marcus Holloway was there, bound and gagged but alive. He had been drugged to keep him quiet, but he was otherwise unharmed. As Sarah freed him, he whispered hoarsely, "The evidence. It's all in my apartment, hidden in the false bottom of my desk drawer." The evidence Marcus had gathered exposed a smuggling operation that had been using the hotel as a front for years. The criminals had been moving stolen artwork and antiquities through the warehouse, using the hotel's forgotten tunnels to transport items without being detected. Marcus, an investigative journalist, had been tracking the operation for months before they discovered his investigation. The men who had kidnapped him had used their knowledge of the hotel's hidden passages to enter his room undetected. They had drugged him and carried him through the wall, then sealed the passage behind them. To anyone examining the room, it would appear that Marcus had simply vanished into thin air. Within a week, the police had arrested all members of the smuggling ring. The warehouse raid yielded millions of dollars in stolen art, and the hotel's hidden passages were permanently sealed. Gerald Brewster, who had been unaware of the criminal activity, implemented new security measures to ensure the hotel's safety. Marcus recovered from his ordeal and published a series of articles about the smuggling operation that earned him a Pulitzer Prize nomination. He credited Detective Chen with saving his life and helping him expose the truth. As for Sarah, the case became one of the most challenging and rewarding of her career. It reminded her why she had become a detective in the first place: to solve the impossible, to find the truth in the darkness, and to ensure that justice prevailed even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The Grandview Hotel returned to its quiet existence, welcoming guests who came seeking nothing more than a comfortable place to sleep. But sometimes, late at night, Sarah would drive past the old building and remember the mystery that had tested every skill she possessed as a detective. The case of the vanishing guest had been solved, but it left her with a deeper appreciation for the hidden secrets that exist in every city, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to look beneath the surface. In the end, the most impossible mysteries often had the simplest explanations, if you knew where to look for the truth. Years later, Sarah would tell new detectives that the key to solving any case was to remember that there was always an explanation, no matter how impossible things might seem. The art was in finding the right questions to ask and following the evidence wherever it led, even if it led through walls that seemed solid and doors that appeared not to exist. The Grandview Hotel stood as a testament to the idea that every building, every room, every seemingly impossible situation held secrets waiting to be uncovered. And sometimes those secrets were hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right person to find the key that would unlock the truth. So close your eyes, let the hush of the night wrap around you, and know this. Some stories don't end. They drift, they dream, they wait for you to listen again. Good night.